Growing up, my dream was always to get my own place. Ever since I was in high school, I really could not wait to move out. The main reason for this was my relationship with my parents. I really hated my dad when I was growing up, and my mom was honestly not much better either. We would constantly butt heads over the smallest things. To make matters worse, my dad would always be drunk on the weekends. It was just a complete mess. As I got older and girls became a factor, it became even more of a problem. There was absolutely no way I was going to bring any girls back to a household like that. So, because of all this, I took the very first opportunity I could get. I moved out when I was 19 years old and starting my college career. I did not move away to school. Instead, I went to a local commuter college not far from home. My parents would not pay for me to go away to school, so I had to make do with what I had. That meant I was on websites like Zillow, Facebook Marketplace, and Craigslist every single day for a very long time, desperately searching for a place of my own. When I finally found a rental that looked promising and, more importantly, budget-friendly, I went to see it immediately. The layout of this apartment is actually a very important detail for what would happen later, so let me describe it. When you walked through the front door, you were immediately welcomed by the living room and dining area, which was all just one big open space. Right adjacent to that area was the kitchen, which was separated from the main living space by a single wall. To get to the only bedroom in the apartment, you had to walk down a relatively long, narrow hallway. This hallway contained two separate closets. I used one of them as a pantry for my food, and I used the other one as a general storage closet. Right next to those closets was the door leading into the bathroom. Then, at the very end of the hallway, was the bedroom door. The bedroom itself was very generously sized. It could fit a queen-sized bed with ease, and it also had two more closets of its own. I was easily able to fit a couple of dressers and a television in there without it feeling cramped at all. The moment I saw it, I was completely sold, especially because it was very budget-friendly. I moved in the very next month, and for a while, my life was totally fine. Fast forward a few months into my lease. One night, I went out with some of my friends in town. We ended up running into some girls we had known for a while, and we all started hanging out. By the end of the night, I ended up taking home a girl whom I had known for a bit through school, though we had never really hung out in a one-on-one setting before. For the sake of the story, I will just call her Sammy. We went back to my apartment and started drinking. We sat on the couch in the living room and put on a movie. We were having a good time, but Sammy made it clear that she did not want to take things any further than that on our very first time hanging out. I completely respected her decision. As the night went on, we decided to move from the living room couch into my bedroom to finish watching the movie we had started. We laid down on the bed, but because we had both had a lot to drink, we ended up passing out somewhere in the middle of the film. The next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps coming from somewhere outside in the hallway. It was still the absolute middle of the night, and everything was pitch black. I rolled over to my side, expecting to see Sammy, but I realized I was completely alone in the bed. I climbed out of bed and looked down the long hallway. Through the darkness, I could see Sammy standing in the living room. She was quietly grabbing her purse and her clothes off the couch, moving as silently as she could. It was obvious she was trying to slip out in the middle of the night to avoid any potential morning awkwardness. I completely understood where she was coming from, so I decided not to say anything or make it weird. I quietly went back to bed, climbed under the covers, and waited. Eventually, I heard the sound of her walking toward the front door. Just to be safe, I called out her name to confirm. There was no response, which confirmed to me that she had indeed stepped outside and closed the door. I got comfortable in my bed and quickly drifted back off to sleep. Probably about another hour passed by before I was suddenly awoken by a loud noise coming from somewhere in the apartment. I immediately sat straight up in my bed, and my heart started pounding. The sudden sound in the middle of the night sent a wave of adrenaline straight through my body. I called out Sammy's name again, thinking maybe she had returned for some reason, but there was only silence. To be completely honest, I was actually too scared to get out of my bed and go investigate. I reached over, picked up my phone, and decided to send Sammy a quick text message. I asked her if she was still inside my house. Looking back, I realized that was a pretty strange thing to do, but in that exact moment I was too scared to do anything else. I stared at my bedroom door, which was still standing completely open. I had been too lazy to get up and close it after I thought Sammy left. I was definitely still feeling the effects of the alcohol we had been drinking earlier, but as I stared into the dark hallway, my eyes locked onto the doorframe. I felt like I could see something wrapped around the edge of the wood. My breathing became incredibly fast and shallow. I still honestly cannot believe I had the courage to do what I did next. I swiped down on my phone screen to open up the control panel, and I pressed the flashlight button. With the bright light now pointing directly at the bedroom door frame, my heart stopped. There, resting on the wood, were two human hands wrapped tightly around the frame, as if someone was peeking into my room from the hallway. But as if they were reacting directly to the bright light of my phone, the hands suddenly tightened their grip for a split second, and then they quickly pulled back out of sight into the dark hallway. The scream that had been trapped in my throat for those 3 terrifying seconds finally broke free. It was a loud, desperate scream of pure dread. I started yelling at the top of my lungs, screaming for them to get out of my house over and over again. By the time I finally forced myself to get out of bed, I crept over and looked down the hallway. It appeared to be completely empty. I quickly reached out and flipped on the hallway light switch, immediately flooding the narrow corridor with bright light. After standing there for a few minutes trying to calm my racing heart and listening closely for any faint sounds, I slowly built up enough courage to check the hallway closets. I opened the pantry and the storage closet, but they were empty. I checked the bathroom, but there was nobody there either. Next, I slowly moved toward the main living area. To be honest, there really were not many places for a person to hide in my living room or dining room. I held my iPhone tightly in my hand as if it were a weapon, slowly creeping toward the nearest light switch. I reached out and flicked it on, instantly illuminating the living space. Just having the room lit up made me feel a little bit better, but there was still the kitchen to check. I walked over to the opening that led into the kitchen and quickly turned on that light as well. Finally, the entire apartment was completely lit up. There was absolutely nobody there. I looked behind the couch, I looked under the tables, and I even went so far as to open the kitchen cabinets that were at floor level, just in case someone was hiding inside them. When I realized that the apartment was completely clear, I ran over to the front door to lock it shut. But as I stood there, a very strange and unsettling thought crept into my mind. I realized that I had never actually heard the front door click shut earlier in the night. Yet, there was not a single living soul in my apartment, besides me. At this point, I decided to call Sammy. I called her repeatedly until she finally answered the phone. When she picked up, her voice sounded incredibly tired and confused. I asked her if she had just been inside my apartment. She told me that she had left a long time ago, because she simply could not fall asleep, and she was already back at her own place. I did not want to explain the terrifying details of what had just happened, so I just told her it was my mistake. I said I thought I had heard a weird noise, and then we hung up. Still feeling incredibly paranoid, I decided to spam call my best friend until he finally woke up and answered. Just like Sammy, he sounded extremely tired and highly confused. I quickly explained every single detail of what had just happened in my apartment. But after listening to my story, my friend told me that he could tell I was still very drunk. He offered an explanation that actually started to calm me down a bit. He suggested that I was highly sleep-deprived and still intoxicated, and that I had probably just experienced a mid-wake-up hallucination. He said my brain was playing tricks on me in the dark. His explanation actually made a lot of sense, especially when I considered the fact that I had never heard the front door shut when the supposed intruder left. I eventually managed to laugh it off, apologized for waking him up in the middle of the night, and hung up the phone. I went back to my bedroom, shut the door, locked it tight, and somehow managed to calm myself down enough to fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up and immediately conducted another thorough search of the entire apartment. Once again, it was completely clear. So, I decided to just go on with my normal day, trying to put the terrifying events of the night before behind me. But at some point during the afternoon, my mind drifted back to that supposed hallucination. I kept thinking about those pale hands wrapped around the wooden doorframe. Out of pure curiosity, I walked over to my bedroom door and closely examined the frame. My heart completely stopped. There, left in the exact positions where I had seen the hands resting the night before, were obvious, oily fingerprints. A wave of intense dizziness washed over me as the horrifying realization set in. It had not been a hallucination at all. Someone had actually been standing in my hallway, staring into my bedroom while I slept. I pulled out my phone and took a photograph of the fingerprints, a photo that I still keep saved in my iCloud storage to this very day. Feeling completely lost, I resorted to calling my dad for some advice. He basically just called me a complete buffoon for leaving my front door unlocked in the first place. He told me that as long as nothing was stolen and the person was gone, I should just take it as a highly valuable learning lesson. Honestly, nothing my dad said during that phone call was untrue, which really sucked to admit. To this day, I still do not know who came into my apartment that night, and I have no idea why they decided to do the absolute creepiest thing they could have possibly done. But as soon as my year-long lease was up, I packed up my things, moved to a better apartment, and never looked back. Now, imagine living in a place that should feel completely safe, but because of how empty it always is, every shadow seems to stretch just a little bit longer. Growing up, my parents' house never really felt like a traditional home. At least, not in the normal way most people experience it. My dad was constantly traveling all over the country for his work, and my mom was almost always out with her friends, staying over at my aunt's house, or doing something else that kept her away. She would typically come home incredibly late at night, or sometimes not come home at all. I know that sounds like a really sad or messed up situation, but to me, it was just my daily reality. It was not as if my parents had abandoned me or did not care about me. It was more like they were just always incredibly busy with their own lives, constantly going somewhere else. So, from the time I was about 16 years old and onward, I basically lived completely alone in this large house. I ate dinner by myself almost every single night. I watched television alone. There were times when I would be the absolute only person in the entire house for a whole weekend. I am an only child, and as I got older, I realized that was probably because my parents quickly figured out after having me just how much they valued their own personal freedom. In that regard, I guess I did suffer a bit from a lack of family connection, which is something I definitely feel much more deeply now as an adult. But when I was younger, I actually used to absolutely love the setup. To me, it felt like ultimate freedom to have such a massive house all to myself. I could do whatever I wanted without having my parents constantly breathing down my neck, and I never had to share anything with siblings. I could bring my friends over whenever I wanted, and we could play video games late into the night. I could talk to girls on the phone for hours, without being embarrassed about my parents overhearing me. It felt like having my very own home without having to pay a single dime for it. Even when I turned 19 and started attending a nearby commuter college, nothing really changed. If anything, the house became even quieter. My mom and dad were gone or out even more than before, and I was basically the one holding down the fort at home. Because I spent so much time there alone, I knew every single noise that house made. That detail is incredibly important because it was not one of those creepy houses where every little creak or groan would freak you out. It was an older but very large house, and it had its usual predictable sounds. I always just used to joke that the place had a lot of character. The events of this story happened on a specific night, when I knew for an absolute fact that I was going to be completely alone. My dad was out of town on a business trip, and my mom had been talking all week about how she was going to stay over at my aunt's house. They were planning some big family gathering for the following day, and my mom did not want to have to drive back home late at night. I remember her looking at me before she left, and telling me that it was just going to be me tonight. Honestly, I did not care at all. It was completely normal for me. I told her that she did not even have to remind me. After she left, I made myself some food, watched some television, and went about my usual routine. At around 11 o'clock that night, I decided to head upstairs to my bedroom. I got into bed and started watching YouTube videos on my laptop, which was something I would often do for hours before falling asleep. My bedroom was located at the very end of the long upstairs hallway. When you walked up the staircase, you would arrive at a small landing. If you turned to the right, you would see my parents' bedroom. If you kept walking further down the hallway, you would pass the bathroom, then the linen closet, and finally, my bedroom door at the very end of the hall. I always kept my bedroom door wide open. My parents had always instructed me to keep the doors open at night, which they claimed was a safety measure to stay alert and listen for any potential intruders. But I also just liked being able to hear the natural sounds of the house. It made the entire experience of being alone in a large house feel a little bit less intense. Eventually, I started getting really tired, so I closed my laptop and just laid there in the dark, scrolling on my phone. I would say that probably about an hour passed, from the moment I shut my laptop to the moment my phone suddenly started vibrating in my hand. I looked down at the screen, and the caller identification display showed that it was an incoming call from a completely restricted number. It simply said, "No caller ID." That was actually the very first time in my entire life that I had ever received a restricted number phone call. I just stared at the screen for a few seconds, feeling a little bit uneasy. To receive a call from an anonymous number that late at night felt sketchy as hell. I decided to ignore it and let it go to voicemail. But the moment the call ended, the phone immediately started ringing again. It was the exact same restricted number. That persistent second ring is what finally made me decide to answer. I figured that if it was someone important, or perhaps an emergency, they would definitely call twice. Plus, I reasoned that it was just a simple phone call. In the absolute worst-case scenario, I could just hang up. So I slid the bar to answer the call and held the phone up to my ear. At first, there was absolutely no noise. It was dead silent. I started to get nervous, thinking it was probably just one of those automated robocalls that dial random numbers to see if they are active, planning to add my number to some telemarketing database. But then, as I kept listening, I started to hear a very faint noise in the background. It took my brain a few seconds to process what the sound actually was. It sounded like the audio of a television playing. What made this incredibly weird was that I could also faintly hear my own television playing downstairs through my open bedroom door. Earlier in the evening, I had left the living room, television turned on at a very low volume just to serve as some comforting background noise. Hearing the sound of a television over the phone line instantly made my entire stomach tighten into a knot. I cleared my throat and said hello for a second time. But once again, there was absolutely no vocal response from the caller. There was only the faint sound of the television. It was as if whoever was on the other end of the line was not even attempting to speak. They were just sitting there holding the phone. And then I realized something that made me sit straight up in my bed, a cold dread washing over me. The television audio that I was hearing through the receiver was not random. It matched the audio of my downstairs television perfectly. There was absolutely no delay. It was the exact same sounds, the exact same words, at the exact same split second. The two audio sources were completely in sync. A terrifying chill ran straight down my spine. There was only one logical explanation for what was happening. The person on the other end of the phone call could hear my television in real time, which meant they had to be standing inside my actual house, right downstairs in the living room. I tried to force my brain to find a normal, non-threatening explanation. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just one of my friends standing outside one of my downstairs windows, trying to play a massive prank on me. Or maybe my phone was somehow glitching, creating some weird feedback loop that was picking up the sound of my own microphone. I knew that technology could do strange things sometimes. But the more I listened to the perfect synchronization of the audio, the more I realized those theories made absolutely no sense. It sounded undeniably like someone was standing right in the middle of my living room, holding their phone out to capture the sound of my TV. I slowly got out of bed, crept over to my open bedroom door, and listened intently. I was now 1,000,000% sure that the audio coming through my phone was perfectly synced to the TV downstairs. In hindsight, What I did next was incredibly foolish. I yelled out into the dark hallway, screaming, "Who is down there?" Deep down, I think I was still desperately hoping that it was just a friend or a family member playing a joke on me. But the very second the words left my mouth, the phone line went completely dead. The caller had hung up. At this point, my mouth went completely dry. I could not even attempt to call the number back because it was completely anonymous. I stepped out of my bedroom and walked into the dark hallway, moving toward the top of the staircase. I stood there, staring down into the darkness of the lower level. I could still hear the low hum of the television playing in the living room, and then I heard a distinct creaking sound. It was the unmistakable sound of the wooden floorboards downstairs cracking under the heavy weight of a person moving. If that sound did not completely confirm my worst fears, what happened next certainly did. From downstairs, I heard the sound of someone clearing their throat. In that exact second, everything became 10 times more real. I could no longer try to lean on the comfort of the glitching phone theory, even though I had already known deep down that it was complete nonsense. Panic took over. I turned around, rushed back into my bedroom, quietly closed the heavy wooden door and turned the lock. I started wondering if maybe my dad was trying to test me. He was always very big on safety and security, and I wondered if he had come home early to see how I would react to a simulated home intrusion. I also thought about my Uncle T, who was known for playing practical jokes. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, but it went straight to voicemail. He was likely fast asleep in his hotel room. It was around 11:30 at night, so I tried calling him again and again, but I had absolutely no luck. So I decided to try calling my Uncle T. To my relief, he answered on the very second ring. I could hear from the groggy tone of his voice that he had been fast asleep in bed. He asked me why the hell I was calling him so late. I started the conversation by telling him that what I was about to say was going to sound completely crazy. Then, I dropped the bomb and asked him if he was currently standing downstairs in my living room. I remember his exact response and his tone of voice vividly. He said, "Steve, what the hell are you talking about?" When I quickly explained the situation, he told me that playing a prank like that was definitely something his brother, my dad, would do. But while we were actively talking on the phone, my screen began to vibrate. I looked down and saw no caller ID flashing across the screen once again. I begged my Uncle T to stay on the line and not hang up. I told him I was putting him on hold so I could answer the other call. He agreed, and I quickly switched over to the incoming call. I held the phone to my ear and said hello. There was the exact same heavy silence. But this time, I did not hear the sound of the television on the other end of the line. I wondered what that meant. Had they moved away from the TV? Then, I realized that they must have had their phone on speaker. I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps. They were moving, and the sound of the footsteps coming through the phone. Speaker began to perfectly match the heavy, physical footsteps that I could suddenly hear walking up the stairs and down the hallway directly toward my bedroom door. I prayed with every fiber of my being that this was just my dad messing with me. But then, my bedroom doorknob began to violently jiggle. Whoever was on the other side of the door began to push their weight against it, trying to force it open. Thank God my parents' house was old, and my bedroom door was a heavy, solid piece of wood with an equally heavy, old-fashioned lock. The sound of the door shaking was perfectly synchronized with the audio coming through the phone. Then, the person standing on the other side of the door knocked. I had a sudden flash of adrenaline and decided to merge the two phone calls together. The moment the calls were connected, I screamed into the phone to my Uncle T, yelling that it was not my dad, and that he needed to get to the house immediately. I also screamed that the person who was inside the house was actively on the phone with us right now. My Uncle T seemed to instantly wake up and realize the extreme danger I was in. He began screaming into the phone, yelling, "I am coming right now, you cocksucker." The anonymous caller immediately hung up the phone. Outside my door, I heard the heavy sound of footsteps quickly running away down the hallway and down the stairs. That confirmed without a doubt that it was definitely not my dad. My Uncle T told me to stay locked inside my room and that he was on his way. We lived in the same town, but the 7 minutes it took for him to drive to my house felt like the longest 5 years of my entire life. I stood there in the dark, clutching my phone, listening to every tiny sound. Finally, I heard the familiar, booming voice of my uncle screaming from downstairs. I ran to my door, unlocked it, and rushed down the stairs. Having him there in the house made me feel an instant wave of relief. Together, we called the police while doing a walkthrough of the house to see if anything had been stolen. The living room television was still humming quietly. Before the police even arrived at the scene, we discovered that the kitchen window was pushed fully open. It was open wide enough for an adult to easily crawl through. We passed all of this info along to the police officers when they arrived. They conducted what I assumed was a standard search of the property, asking us to lead them around the house while they walked closely behind us with their flashlights. We cleared every single room, and it was clear that whoever had been inside was long gone. Once the search was complete, the officers asked to see my phone's call history so they could log the restricted calls. I showed them the no-caller ID entries. One of the officers explained that even though the number was hidden, the police department could still request the official phone records from the carrier and trace the origin of the calls. He said it would take a few days, but they would get back to us. My Uncle T stayed over at the house that night, which made me feel incredibly safe. We kept every single light in the house turned on, just like terrified little kids. A few days later, I received a phone call from one of the detective officers. To my absolute shock, they had successfully traced the number back to someone I actually knew. It was an old acquaintance of mine from high school. He was not a close friend, and he was not an enemy either, but he was someone who had my phone number and knew where my parents' house was located. I had not seen or spoken to him in several years. The police asked if I wanted to accompany them to his house while they questioned him. My Uncle T came along as well, since he had been there on the night of the incident. When the guy's father answered the front door and saw the police officers standing there, he immediately called his son downstairs without asking any questions. The moment the son walked into the room and saw me standing there with the police, I could see the intense look of nervousness spread across his face. The officer asked him straight up if he had made those anonymous phone calls to me. He immediately denied it. He claimed that his cell phone had actually been stolen a few days prior to the incident. He said he had lost it at a party and had simply never gotten it back. The detective asked him why he had not reported the phone as stolen. The guy just shrugged his shoulders and said he was planning on buying a new phone anyway, so he did not think it was a big deal. The officer told him they would follow up if they needed anything else, and that was pretty much the end of the interaction. His father just stood there the entire time, watching the exchange in complete silence, without saying a single word. There was no dramatic confession, no big gotcha moment, and no arrest was ever made. That night, I lay awake in bed, unable to stop thinking about it. I kept picturing the incredibly nervous look on his face when he walked down the stairs. Was it a look of pure guilt, or was it just the natural reaction that anyone would have when being confronted by police on their doorstep? If his story was actually true, and his phone had been stolen, that meant some random stranger had stolen his phone specifically to call me and break into my parents' house. Honestly, that explanation was 1,000,000 times more terrifying than the idea of it just being him. When we are young, the houses of our closest friends often feel like a second home. We know the layout by heart, we know the family, and we feel completely secure within those walls. But safety is an illusion that can be shattered in a single silent moment. It was a typical weekend, just like so many others we had experienced before. The usual group of friends was getting ready to meet up at Cody's house to pregame before heading out to the local bars. This was during the period shortly after we had all graduated from college. We were all around 23 to 24 years old at the time. Cody's house was almost always the designated spot for our pregame and postgame gatherings. The main reason for this was that he had an incredibly cool, spacious basement, where his parents could not hear us making noise. On top of that, his parents were extremely relaxed and chill people who did not mind us hanging out. We would sit down there, listen to music, and they would sometimes even bring us down snacks. On this particular night, it was just the four of us planning to go out to some of the local bars: Cody, Randy, Jake, and myself. Once all four of us had arrived at Cody's place and had a few drinks, we decided to figure out who was going to call the Uber. Once the ride was booked, we piled into the car and headed out into the night. We spent the next few hours bouncing around a bunch of local dive bars, before eventually ending up at a crowded dance bar. By the time the night was winding down, Cody and I realized we were both completely exhausted and ready to call it a night. Randy and Jake, however, were still full of energy and decided they wanted to stay out much later. Cody ordered an Uber to take us back to his place. When we finally arrived, he was nice enough to offer me the pull-out couch in the basement, so I would not have to drive home late. He came downstairs with me to help me set up the bed and get some sheets. While we were down there, we decided to play a quick game of Madden on his console. I have always been absolutely terrible at that video game. Cody picked the Kansas City Chiefs and I chose the local team, and he ended up completely destroying me. I threw 3 interceptions on my first 3 possessions, and he just laughed at me. I did not want to play another round because I was feeling incredibly tired and just wanted to sleep off the alcohol before the inevitable hangover made things even worse. Cody said goodnight, went back upstairs, and shut the basement door behind him. I was left entirely alone in the darkness of the basement. The only things that kept the basement from being in complete and total blackness were a few tiny light sources. There was the digital clock display from the cable box sitting under the television, the tiny red standby light on the television itself, and a soft green glow coming from a Heineken mini fridge situated on the far side of the basement. The mini fridge also made a low, humming sound that provided a weirdly relaxing white noise, which helped me fall asleep almost instantly. I knocked out like a baby, a very drunk baby. When I woke up, the basement was still completely dark. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew it had to be either very late at night or extremely early in the morning, somewhere around 3 or 4 in the morning. The first thing I noticed was that my mouth was incredibly dry. It was that terrible sticky cottonmouth feeling that you get after drinking too much alcohol. It was so bad that I could barely even move my jaw. I realized how stupid I had been for not bringing a bottle of water down to the basement with me before going to sleep. I really did not want to get up. It is a very familiar and highly relatable feeling of conflict that anyone who has ever woken up hungover and thirsty has experienced. You are desperately thirsty, but your body is too heavy and tired to move. I tried to ignore the thirst at first. I rolled over onto my side to get a look at the Heineken mini fridge, hoping that maybe there was some water inside it, but I knew it was only stocked with alcohol. And then, for some completely unknown reason, my eyes suddenly darted to the far corner of the basement. At first, I thought my eyes were just playing tricks on me because of the dark. But as I stared, I could swear that I was looking at a large, black mass standing in the corner of the room. I tried to wait patiently for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, desperately hoping that the black shape would turn out to be some innocent object, like a coat rack or a pile of clothes thrown over a chair. But the longer I stared at the shape, the more my heart began to sink. The black mass was slowly shifting. It was undeniably a person, standing perfectly still in the dark, watching me. The sheer amount of mental restraint I had to exercise to keep myself from screaming out loud was absolute insanity. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who it could be. I knew it could not be Cody, because the sheer height and build of the shadow did not match him at all. It was someone much larger. Without letting panic completely take over, I had to quickly figure out a way to escape from the basement. After a few incredibly tense minutes of lying perfectly still, I decided to put on an act. I slowly sat up on the pull-out couch and let out a massive, fake yawn. I stretched my arms out wide, pretending that I was completely oblivious to the presence of the person standing in the corner. I then started fake talking to myself out loud. I began muttering complaints under my breath about how thirsty I was, complaining about how stupid I was for not bringing a glass of water downstairs. I did this to give the appearance that I was just a tired, oblivious guy getting up to grab a drink, rather than someone who was running away in absolute terror. I slowly swung my legs out of the bed and stood up. I began walking toward the staircase. But because of the layout of the basement, walking toward the stairs meant I actually had to walk closer to the corner where the figure was standing. It was easily the most terrifying and tense moment of my entire life. As I took each slow, deliberate step, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I turned to the right to reach the bottom of the stairs, praying with everything I had that the figure would not suddenly lunge forward and grab me from behind. When I finally reached the bottom of the staircase, I did not run. I forced myself to take the first few steps up at a normal, casual pace, wanting to maintain the illusion that I had no idea they were there. But when I reached about the halfway point of the staircase, I could not resist the urge to look back. I took a quick glance down over my shoulder. My stomach dropped. The black mass was no longer standing in the corner. It was now standing right at the very bottom of the staircase, looking directly up at me. I completely lost my composure. I stumbled and almost tripped over my own feet as I scrambled up the remaining stairs as fast as I possibly could. I reached the top of the stairs, burst through the door, and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I did not stop running. I flew up the next flight of stairs leading to the upper level of the house. I ran straight into Cody's bedroom, grabbed him by the shoulders, and shook him awake. I was yelling at him at the top of my lungs, telling him that there was someone downstairs in the basement, and that he needed to wake up his dad immediately. During the middle of all this loud commotion, the sound of a loud, heavy slam echoed from the lower level of the house. I looked at Cody and yelled, "See?" Cody got up and we went to his parents' room where we woke up his dad, and I told him there is someone in the basement. He got right out of bed without asking questions and ran down both flights of stairs to the basement. Noting that the basement door was wide open, and when I mentioned I shut the basement door, Cody's dad yelled at Cody to call the cops, and he did. We also noticed the back door to the house was now open, which meant the intruder had fled into the dark night. So when the three of us were done looking through the basement, we all went into the cold backyard to search, using our phone flashlights. We checked the side gates, then moved to the front yard, and then scanned the neighboring yards. All while Cody was still describing what was going on to the 911 operator, his voice shaking with adrenaline. I would say we were searching for 15 minutes before the police finally arrived. And then they did their full search and formally wrote up a report for the incident. By the end of it, there were some neighbors waking up and coming outside asking if everything was okay. By that point, I was sobered up, terrified, and wanted to go home. So as soon as the cops left, I went inside to talk with them for a bit. Then I said goodbye and called an Uber home, refusing Cody's offer to drive me home because I wanted him to stay with his family. The quiet ride back to my own house in the dark was surreal, just staring out the window and wondering who that person was. I worried for them a bit that night, but I was absolutely not sleeping in that basement after that. In fact, I never did again. We would still have pre-games and stuff there, but the feeling in that basement changed for a while after that night, where I would always glance at that corner of the basement and just think back to that night, that black mass. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.